Okay, this is where we left it in the end of the last video. And before we go on to add any more bits, just want to construct here, or to talk about this constructor. This is what makes the page work. This is what makes the page itself, is that when this is called, this initializes this component. And in many of the things that we do, we don't do in this particular page actually, but we can put code inside here if we want to run when the point of initiation takes place. For example, you might want to populate some controls with some data, so you do this at the point of initialization. But we don't do that here. What we're going to do though is we're going to set up things that come before the initialization takes place. And we're going to need some variables that handle data as we move through the application's processes. Now I've got them here on my clipboard, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste them in and explain what they do and what they are. So here are the first ones. They're handler variables. They just hold data as we need it. And they're internal because they exist only within the scope of this particular module. A string is the data type that we've got to use. The forename is what's going to be held in it, and we initialize it with string.empty. It's not the same as null. It's actually got a value in it called string.empty. And you can test for string.empty, and you can say that you want to acknowledge the fact that it's there, but it's not actually being populated with any other data than the one that we've used to set it up. So here's the next one, which is going to be the next set of variables that we're going to have to use. And we use these for tracking whether we've got data that we need. And it's a good way of tracking for errors, where the user hasn't entered a vital piece of data, and we can track that error, and we can indicate that we don't want to go any further, for example, if not everything that we need is there. So that's what we do with these, and it's a very good way of making sure that we can track things as they happen. One of the interesting things about bool values that you get is that you can see in this one I put string valid equals false. If we never actually initialize them, their default state will be false. And in the next piece of code you'll see that I do make one explicitly false in the code, but the other ones I don't, because they will be initialized as false by default. So what we want to do now is we want to build up a big long function that makes sure that when people are pressing a button to process the data, that all the data that is needed in order for the process to work is there. And we're going to call that method harvest data, and it's going to take a bit of explanation, and it will be the whole of the rest of this video. So this I tend to do in a certain way. So here I've got a button click event, and I've got these worker sort of methods that are sitting down here below, and I tend to put the worker methods at the bottom of the module rather than have them interfering with what's happening in the interface, kind of separating the things into regions of the module. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a method in here which is going to be called private bool harvest data. And that's going to be our method. Now it's moaning because it doesn't return anything at the moment, so let's just set it up so that we can put some variables in there and then show what we are going to return in the end once we've checked all the values we need to check. So these variables that I'm putting here are method variables. They exist in this method only, and it says, oh, you're not using this properly yet and all this, and there's little green underlines, and we're going to use them. So I've got forename data, and I'm explicitly setting that to false. That's one of the ones that we set up here as tracker variables up here. I've deliberately set it to false as a method that you can use. Then we've got object data. We've got form data, which is an instance of this class here that we created, this private class, and we're calling it form data. And then I've got data present equals 0, and bool all data is false. So this bool is what we will actually return once the processing is done. So return all data. No moaning now. It says, okay, we've got a return value. So the processing will happen in this part of the method here, and we're now getting the return value from this. So I'm going to remind you of what we do here in order to put comments in for a method inside a function, triple or the forward slashes. So I'm then going to put a description in here, harvest form data. So we have 3 bits of data to gather. So we're going to do the first one first, is obviously the forename. And what we do, so let me just move this up here so that it's in the middle of the screen. If, and what's the conditional check? If the forename text box text is not equal to the empty string, then form data forename is the whatever's in that text box. Forename data is true, and then data present will increase the count by 1. Okay, so that's good. So we've now checked the forename. It's there in the form, and that we've got something with which we can make a data element in this form data class. Right, so I'm going to go into the next one. So obviously this is going to be surname. So if the surname text box text is not equal to the empty string, then we've got something in there. It doesn't mean it's a forename or a surname, does it? It just means there's something in the box. Then the form data surname, this bit, is going to be whatever's in that particular text box. Okay, surname data is true, increase our count by 1. So you can see what we're doing here. I'm sure you can work out what we're doing. Else, you tell the user that you've got no surname to work with and surname data is false. So let's move on to the next one. And this is where the user string is checked. So you might remember that there are 2 things we have to check about the user string. Firstly, that it's there because we need it in order to create the data that we were working with, and secondly, that it meets the length rule. And if you remember, the length rule was 8, I think, in this case. Yes, it was 8 in this case. So we're going to use what's called a nested if. And that's where one if lives inside another if. So that if one part's true, then we check if the other part's true, and we return 2 separate errors if either of them don't meet the standard that we're looking for. So here's our nested if method. So if I do kind of that highlight there, that's the nested inside if, and that's where we're checking the length rule. And the outside one is where we're checking whether there's data there in the first place that we need to check, or and so forth. Right, so if it's not empty, the user string box, same as before, then let's get what's in that box. So form data, our data structure here, user string, is that. Then we check the length. Now we could have moved that down there after we've checked the length, and perhaps that actually would have been a better place to do it. But then we check the length. And how do we check the length? We use that class that we've got, utility globals, and it says length rule. And if you remember, the length rule in utility globals was just saying, is it 8 equal to 8 or more? And if it is, then we can say that the user string data is true, and we can increase the data present count by 1. If it's not, we say that it doesn't meet the length rule, and presuming that this one was false, if there's nothing in the box, then you must enter a key string message would come up. So you can see that having established that there's something there, now we can check whether it's the right thing that is there in terms of the length of the particular string that we've got. So we're on the home straight here. So we've checked each text box, made sure that there was something in it, and if there's something in it was okay, we then added those to the object that we're using to track the data. So what we do now is make sure that we've got all of the elements that we need. Now we were counting up data present equals 1, data present equals 1, and adding 1 through the increment value. So now we say, have we got 3? And if we have got 3, we can now take what we've got in the object and put it into these variables. So these variables are now available throughout this page module because we've gathered them using this harvest data method. So let's just go down here, so I've gone too hard on this. Right. We then can say all data is true, and that's what's going to be returned there. And if there aren't 3, all data is false. This is a pretty crude system of making sure that you've got all of the elements of the data that you wanted, but it works. And what we are doing here is that if we wanted to implement anything much more sort of sophisticated than that, take a lot of code, and we don't have time. So we're going to assume that people are going to do the right thing and put values in every text box. And we hope that we track all the errors and cap all the errors off at the point where we find them. But that's what we're doing here. So we've now got all the data, and it's been put into these control variables up here and available for use in the rest of this module on the page.